So, like a lot of people, I spent the previous week playing The Last of Us Part 2, and it was alright. My favourite part was the multiplayer. I didn't realise Naughty Dog were going to focus so much on PvP, but it seems to have paid off, and I must say, the decision to use platforms outside of the game itself to allow people to fight each other is certainly an interesting one. To be honest, it looks like people just can't get enough, and maybe they should turn it into an esport and set up a pro league. I mean, I want to see what the Koreans can bring to the meta. Nah, I'm just joking. This PvP sucks. I always feel like a little bit of controversy and heated discussion can be a good thing. It shows people care, it's a sign someone took risks, and that something generated an emotional response in people. But there's obviously a point where it all becomes too much, and reasonable discussion just gets crushed underneath a landslide of outrage and hyperbole. And The Last of Us Part 2 sure created a pretty big landslide. It almost feels unprecedented. Really though, it was a bit strange playing this game and getting to the end of my 4-day, spoiler-free internet hiatus, and then checking back into the internet at large to see what other people were saying. It was a bit like coming home from a relaxing weekend away to find the place broken into with feces smeared on the wall and a hobo now living upstairs. In short, it was a bit of a mess, and part of me thought I should just turn around and walk away, move on to the next game instead of getting involved, because that's what a mature, well-adjusted adult would do. But I've spent 28 years not listening to my better judgment, so I don't see why I should start now. Anyway, I said strange back then, instead of something like unexpected, because despite doing my best to avoid all discussion of this game in an attempt to avoid spoilers, I still found there was such an excess of noise being made about The Last of Us Part 2 that the existence of some controversy had registered on my radar before I even had a chance to play the game. And that's an impressive feat, because my radar is probably like one of those dumb dowsing rod things that people claim can smell water rather than any piece of functional technology. After all, I sit in my room all day not talking to people and playing video games, so when I hear about something during a time like this, it's a pretty clear sign that something, somewhere, has gone wrong. And that's what this video is about. Rather than taking a more conventional approach and just giving my opinion on the game from my experience, for once that seemed a little too middle of the road and safe, so I thought instead I'd focus on other people's opinions and judge them. After all, not all opinions are equal, and there's been a lot of nefarious accusations and exaggerations going around, so why not try to get to the bottom of it all? Which is why I set out to read as much as possible about other people's points of views to assemble a list of reasons for why people think this game is a masterpiece, or the opposite, that I could then go through in this video point by point to question the validity of the most common things that people seem to be saying. And then, at the end of all that, you and me might be closer to understanding what exactly happened with this game. And through that, maybe we'll be able to gain an understanding of those who think differently to us, to break the cycle of game reviewer versus gamer violence and find peace in the midst of all this chaos. Or maybe we'll walk away from it all having achieved nothing other than a newly acquired post-traumatic stress disorder and a few missing fingers. Who knows? Usually I'd give a spoiler warning around about here, but after the past week I feel like that word has lost all meaning, so let's just jump into it and start at the beginning, by which I mean the ending of the first game. The Last of Us Part 1 is going to come up quite a lot in this video. If it's not obvious, it was a game people liked. Game journalists, fans, overly critical YouTubers, the praise was fairly unanimous. There was a growing skepticism back in 2013 about something detractors were labelling as movie games, which were games which focused on cinematics at the expense of gameplay. This is what developer Naughty Dog had really become known for with the success of the Uncharted series, but even amongst those worried about some movie game apocalypse, The Last of Us still seemed to find a begrudging amount of respect, because it had something many other games lack: a good story. Although that doesn't mean it was an original story. You had a zombie apocalypse, the struggles of survival for the last of humanity, the one person with the cure, a gruff older guy protagonist, a slow but endearing father-daughter style relationship, and so on, you get the idea. If you were to play bingo with post-apocalyptic / zombie cliches, this game wouldn't do very well. But the lack of originality didn't matter too much because The Last of Us told its story well. With a high overall level of presentation, 2 very strong central characters, a connection between the themes of survival and the gameplay, and a real sense of journey and growth and emotion over the game's 15 or so hours of runtime. Really, it was hard not to be won over, even if you thought some aspects were generic. And then there was the ending, and I'm not someone who worshipped this game or held it up as one of the all-time greats, but I still think this is one of the strongest and most impactful endings I have ever seen in a video game. After facing much hardship following your journey across America as Joel to deliver Ellie, who is the only known person to be immune to the mushroom zombie infection, to a group known as the Fireflies, Joel is then told the only way to develop a vaccine is to remove samples from Ellie's brain in an operation that would be fatal. Joel doesn't accept this and so makes his way through the Firefly base, killing those who get in his way in order to save Ellie's life, which he does, while potentially dooming humanity along the way.
Wait! Let me go! Please.
You just come after her.
The ending was dark. The player is forced to do something bad, to kill people who may not deserve it for a cause that may not be worth it, and there are many different opinions and interpretations of the right and wrong of this situation. But no matter what your opinion was on Joel's actions, whether you agree with them or disagree, you still always understand them. We understand why Joel does what he does. We understand how a man who has lost his daughter once already might not be willing to lose that again. We understand the desire to save an innocent life, and we understand the ability of the human mind to conjure excuses, like a vaccine wasn't even guaranteed. And so this ending was powerful and ambiguous and personal and represented a true high mark in video game narratives.
You don't understand.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
So it's no surprise that the ending and its morally dark themes were one of the most praised things about the game, and I wonder how much that praise might have played a role in the direction the sequel would take. There was a lot of talk about video games finally being able to tell adult stories, or that games had surpassed movies. The word art was thrown around a lot, and I'm sure if Roger Ebert wasn't so busy dying of cancer, his gaming redemption arc would have been right around the corner. Really, the praise could be a little much, as if for some it was just an excuse to push the games are finally art narrative. But excessive praise can go a little too far, and that doesn't mean it's not founded on some truth. Still, I wonder what it's like to be on the receiving end of that praise, as was the case for the game's creative director, Neil Druckmann, who would later take the role of project lead and director of the sequel. And I think the praise and the game's legacy and the newly established fandom all play a role in this story. Expectations were high for The Last of Us Part 2, and there must have been a lot of pressure to deliver, particularly in regards to the narrative. It took 7 years for fans to get the sequel they longed for, and a lot can happen in such a period of time. The gaming industry saw its share of changes, including everyone's favourite Gamergate in 2014, which started several discussions on politics in video games that still haven't really went away, as well as changes for Naughty Dog, such as key staff leaving and new scrutiny of their working conditions. Still, the biggest event in this game's story was the leaks. If you, like me, didn't pay attention to these leaks and avoided spoilers, then you might be interested to learn that a lot of the information leaked about this game was incorrect, as was some of the information surrounding the leaks themselves, such as the story about how they were the result of a disgruntled Naughty Dog employee. The leaks actually just came from Naughty Dog being hacked, which meant someone gained access to the game's developer server, through which they were able to copy a lot of the game's files, including cutscenes and level lists. These were then uploaded to the internet on April 26, although they have since been removed. Still, this was enough for people to determine many of the game's plot elements, but not all of them. After all, the cutscenes weren't ordered, and they also lack a lot of context because despite this being a cutscene heavy game, there's still a lot of dialogue and events which take place outside cutscenes, which meant the leaks gave a pretty fractured depiction of the game's events. But there were multiple sources who all claimed to have some form of insider knowledge and offered full outlines of the game's plot, and none of these were true. Let this be a lesson to those of you who believe whatever leaks or rumours you come across on Reddit or 4chan. People make shit up for attention, and other people believe them because leaks are exciting. But they're almost always wrong. Anyway, for The Last of Us Part 2 leaks, most of the confusion surrounded the ending, as well as the order of the game's events, and none of the major leaks seemed to correctly predict that both Ellie and Abby would survive. Still, even if the leakers were full of shit, the cutscenes weren't, and so many key details, like Joel dying, were confirmed, and people weren't happy. It's pretty clear that the leaks were effective at poisoning the well of public opinion about the game. That makes sense because not only was some of the information leaked quite shocking, it was also delivered without context. Looking at cutscenes out of order won't give you the best impression of a story, so if people were angry over events like Joel dying, finding that information out in this format probably didn't help. Still, it's interesting to look back on the reaction to these leaks, partly because there are lots of people who didn't mind the leaked stories. In fact, some people seemed so determined to praise the game that they were praising things that weren't true, like Joel being a ghost. But, for the most part, there were two things people were unhappy about: Joel's death and having to play as Abby, the person who kills him. And both of these things were completely true. Really, if anything, the leaks made them seem less outrageous, with several plot outlines ending with Abby's death, or saying the Abby sections were relatively short. And so I think it's safe to say that if the real plot had been leaked instead of these people's made up interpretations, it wouldn't have made any difference to fan reception. However, the same can't be said for if there were no leaks at all. This plot information had a big impact on public perception before anyone had even played the game. This information spread through online communities, gaining further attention through online articles and YouTube videos, and just as the information spread with time, so too did the fan hatred of it, to the point where people had worked themselves up into a frenzy where they were determined to hate the game no matter what it was actually like to play. And so when release day finally came about, and the Metacritic user score opened up to members of the public, this happened. In just hours, The Last of Us Part 2 had one of the lowest user scores of all time, and a record-breaking amount of user reviews. And we'll look more at the reasons for why that is and whether it's accurate, but not before looking at the other side of this story, which brings us to the other side of this Metacritic page. Yeah, so if everyone was meant to hate The Last of Us Part 2, someone must have forgot to tell those in the gaming media, because the critic reviews were tremendously positive, with many perfect scores, frequent use of words like masterpiece, and for a while it was the highest rated game released on the PlayStation 4. And you know, if on the morning of release I was forced to pick a side in this debate, to swear allegiance to one group or the other, at this point I'd be going with the game journalists, because for all the flaws of conventional game reviews or game journalists in general, at least they actually played the game. And when it comes to the value of someone's opinion on something, that's quite an important factor. It's like trusting a vegan review of a good quality steak. Just because someone wants their voice to be heard doesn't mean it's worth hearing. But then I played the game, and those previously clearly defined lines started to blur a bit, although not right away. The Last of Us Part 2 is initially very impressive. The first thing you'll notice are the gorgeous graphics, which stand out on both a technical and artistic level for their consistent high level of quality. And other areas of the presentation aren't exactly far behind, with realistic and visceral sound design, an endless stream of seemingly bespoke animations, and rote physics that can make even the most cheerful of gamers curious about whether they can hang their in-game character. There's an attention to detail here that few games can compete with, from the way upgrading a weapon in a menu seamlessly leads to an actual animation of this modification, to the careful interplay between the flourishing areas of nature and urban decay in the game's main location of Seattle. Simply put, this game looks fantastic, and all it took was years of development, millions of dollars of funding, hundreds of developers, and months of family-destroying crunch. I guess it was worth it in the end though, right? Really though, while I do think there's a risk of putting graphics on too high a pedestal, credit should still be given where it's due. Technically, this is a hugely impressive game, as every review happily points out, but that alone isn't enough to justify a 10 out of 10 score. So, what about gameplay? Well, despite how much discussion there's been on this game, a lot of that hasn't really concerned itself with this subject. And when it does, there often seems to be a sense that people's opinions on gameplay just match their opinion on story. But at around 25 hours long, you'll spend quite a long time playing this game, so it seems worth looking at what you'll be doing, even if that's not where the real controversy lies. So, at its core, The Last of Us Part 2 is similar to the first game, being divided into exploration sections and combat. Exploration consists of moving through mostly linear areas while scavenging for supplies and solving very basic problems in order to work out where to go. In terms of exploration, Part 2 is bigger. One section early on breaks away from the usual linear structure to provide something more open with optional areas to explore. This is a nice change of pace, and I particularly enjoyed how it utilises an in-game map to aid the player in their navigation rather than any mini-maps, GPS or waymarker systems. This map is simple, but so few games even attempt things like this that it's still good to see, and of everything in this game, this one small addition might be the main thing that I hope other developers will take notice of. Outside of this one large open area, the rest of the game follows the same linear approach people would expect from a Naughty Dog game, except the linear path you follow is often far wider than in previous titles. There are lots of buildings now that you can take time to enter, and often multiple paths and alleys that will funnel you towards a specific destination, but still give you a bit of freedom in how you reach that destination. This has the overall effect of making the level design more believable and more immersive, and it rarely feels like a linear path, even if it actually is. With this increase in size comes an increase in scavenging, and this is less positive because over the course of this reasonably long game, the endless scavenging starts to overstay its welcome. It's not very interesting picking up the same items over and over, and unlike in the first game, where resources were generally more scarce, Part 2 feels much more generous. I played on hard and always found myself very well stocked on ammo, health and crafting materials, to the point where I quickly became sick of seeing the words "full" everywhere I looked. And it doesn't even make much sense. I have a decent sized backpack, so why can I only carry 9 rifle bullets or 8 shotgun shells? Ammo isn't very big, and you'd think 25 years into this zombie apocalypse, bullets might be somewhat valuable. But not only are they laying around everywhere, you're also not allowed to pick up more than a handful for each weapon. I have no idea if this is the same as in the first game, because despite playing that game multiple times, I never had such a problem with too much ammo. Although part of the reason for that is because The Last of Us was actually very deceptive in how it handled ammunition. If you had lots of ammo, enemies wouldn't drop any more, but as soon as you get low, some line of code kicks into action to trigger enemies to start dropping ammo again. If you know the game is doing this, it comes across as very artificial, and in a game where resource management is a key part of the gameplay, this design feels cheap. However, it had a big advantage in that it kept the player low on resources, which meant the player is forced to scrape by with what they have and adapt in the midst of combat. This created a constant struggle for survival that the player experiences through the gameplay, which connects to the theme of survival seen in the story and setting. In Part 2 though, this is lost. The generous amount of resources you find gives the impression that survival is easy now, and the story often backs this idea up. The first location in-game, Jackson County, is positively flourishing, with blacksmiths, movie nights, and even a private weed farm set up in someone's basement. The main faction in Seattle seem to be doing alright as well, and not only do they have the resources to keep fighting another rival faction for years, despite the zombies all around them, they even have enough ammo that they shoot targets for fun in their downtime. And I can't help but wonder where this ammo is even coming from. I mean, I know Americans like their guns, but this stuff should run out at some point, surely. It's been 25 years. As far as I know, bullets don't just grow on trees, but if all your knowledge of the world came from The Last of Us Part 2, I'd understand how you might make the mistake of thinking bullets do grow in kitchen cabinets and desk drawers. All the buildings you go through have clearly been looted already, so I really wonder why the looters always seem to have taken everything except the bullets. Well, maybe it's because in this world people can only carry 9 bullets at a time, who knows. When you're not admiring the view or finding bullets growing in cupboards, there's also the other part of exploration, which is finding out where to go. This task is so simple that I don't think you can really consider these sections as puzzles, and if they are puzzles, the solution for 90% of them would just be look up slightly and you'll see the solution. That's fine though, because the first game was similarly simple, and I don't think most of this game's audience are here for puzzles anyway. They're here to kill people, which leads us to the combat. Like the first game, the player is given some freedom in how they approach combat encounters, which means as well as going in guns blazing, you have the option to take enemies out through stealth, as well as to just sneak or run through these encounters in an attempt to bypass the combat entirely. Unlike the first game though, stealth is now really fun. Part 2 makes great use of grass of varying lengths, as well as the new option to go prone, and more silent weapons to give the player a lot more options when trying to kill enemies without being detected. The best change, however, is just how large many of the game's areas are. There's not just 3 or 4 enemies following standard patrols, instead you'll frequently find yourself in sprawling combat sections where you're taking down 10 or 15 enemies in a row while hoping to avoid detection. There's a vast array of paths through these arenas, and quite a lot of diversity to the terrain and enemy types you encounter, which encourages you to think about your approach as you plan and adapt on your way to slaughter anyone foolish enough to get in your path. And unlike something like the scavenging, the killing never got old for me. There's an easy to appreciate cinematic quality to the gameplay of The Last of Us Part 2. Everything looks great, and you'll find moments where stealth might go wrong and you seamlessly transition to running for your life, or find yourself trapped in a tent shootout with some zombies in a darkened apartment building, and without ever taking control away from the player for a cutscene or a QuickTime event, there'll be that movie-like feel to everything. It's like the culmination of Naughty Dog's modern approach to game design, where once they impressed people with scripted set pieces, but now they've come far enough that those set pieces almost create themselves and play out organically as a direct result of your actions, and when that happens it can be really impressive. Still, the best single part of The Last of Us 2's gameplay is the stealth, and as a stealth game, it's pretty good. I wouldn't say great though. If you were to compare it to other stealth games, its flaws are pretty apparent. There's no clever use of light like in Thief or Splinter Cell, no vast array of fun tools like in Metal Gear or Dishonored, and no sprawling sandboxes to play around in like in Hitman. Overall, The Last of Us Part 2 stealth is quite simple, and it's also not very difficult. When enemies are close to seeing you, a noise plays to tell you you're in danger. You'll be hearing that noise a lot, because bullets may be everywhere in this apocalypse, but I guess good opticians are hard to find or something. According to some peer-reviewed scientific article I found on Google, it takes humans about 0.1 second to see something. So keep that in mind every time this warning noise plays to tell you an enemy is looking your way but somehow hasn't seen you yet. Of course, if enemies could see you in 0.1 of a second, stealth wouldn't work very well, but the time it takes for them to spot you still seems slightly ridiculous. They also don't act very intelligently. When they spot a dead friendly, they like to walk over to them and give you a chance to kill them too, before they start shouting to alert their allies that something's wrong. When they do enter alert mode, which is what happens when they know there's an enemy but don't know where, they still just wander around out in the open, rather than trying to make use of cover or sneak themselves. The Scars, who are a faction that you spend most of the second half of the game fighting, take this even further by whistling all the time. So you'll be there picking them off one by one in stealth, and then they just start whistling to let you know exactly where they are. And zombies also seem to deliberately handicap themselves. Most of the non-blind ones you encounter just seem to stand around and look straight down at the floor, just to make sneaking up on them as easy as possible. I could go on here, but despite how easy it is, it doesn't mean the stealth's bad. In fact, maybe it's because it's so incredibly forgiving that it ends up being so enjoyable. If Spider-Man really makes you feel like Spider-Man, then The Last of Us Part 2 really makes you feel like a fucking killing machine, to the point where realism starts to go out the window and you're left with something very traditional for a video game. It's gameplay that's empowering and unrealistic and enjoyable. It's as if you have some advanced stealth suit to mask the sound of your movement, superhuman strength to effortlessly wrestle foes to the ground, a sixth sense to warn you when someone's close to seeing you, and some kind of Jedi mind trick where when you grab enemies, you just say, "Quiet."
Quiet.
And it forces them to never scream or cry for help. You're like a stealth god, and picking off large packs of enemies without being seen really makes you feel like this apex predator that normal humans don't stand a chance against, and honestly, I had more fun in these stealth sections than I ever had with the first game's combat. It's not grounded, it's not deep, it's not challenging, and it's not saying anything important about the game's themes, but it is very enjoyable, and combined with how good the game looks and how smoothly it's animated, and the great sound design, and the atmosphere of these locations, and man, playing as a psychotic killer has rarely been so much fun. So when it comes to gameplay, The Last of Us Part 2 is good. If you're more concerned about how a game looks and feels to play, rather than the depth of its systems, you could easily say the gameplay is great. Although I still can't get on board with the notion that The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay is elevating its themes or story, like some critic reviews claim, because it seems the exact opposite to me. But we'll get to that subject later. And the gameplay has almost nothing to do with the high critic score anyway. I mean seriously, the amount of words dedicated to talking about gameplay in these reviews seems surprisingly low. Some reviews, like that of the Washington Post, which calls this game one of the best ever made, doesn't have a single mention of any part of the gameplay in the entire review, and others aren't much better. Most just have a few words that serve more as an acknowledgement that gameplay exists, and act as a springboard to get back to talking about other apparently more important things. It gives a strong impression that for critics, gameplay doesn't matter that much, so I guess that means we should move on. But that begs the question, if gameplay doesn't explain the high critic score, what does? Well, the answer is story, themes, and characters, and that happens to be the exact same thing that fans reacted so negatively to. There's a lot to go over here, but let's take things chronologically. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 4 years after the first game, where Joel and Ellie have settled down in a somewhat idyllic settlement in Jackson County. A new group of unknown characters arrive near Jackson to look for someone. We then take control of one of these characters called Abby, who gets caught up in a zombie snowstorm before being saved by Joel and his brother Tommy. Abby then leads the two back to her group, where she shoots Joel in the knee with a shotgun and then tortures him to death with a golf club. Ellie arrives just in time to watch Abby finish the act, and with that, the protagonist of the first game is gone. This new group then departs, leaving Ellie and Tommy alive, and then we skip forward a couple of days with Ellie setting off with her friend Dina to go to Seattle to try and find and kill Abby in a quest for revenge. The death of Joel is by far the biggest factor in public outcry against this game. A lot of the reasons for that are because of things which happen later in the narrative, but many people had a problem with the death itself. This was partly because Joel was a beloved character who, as the protagonist of the last game, was someone that many players connected to and identified with. To be killed so quickly and so brutally wasn't only shocking, some argued it was disrespectful, that it was like spitting in the face of fans who liked this character and who wanted him to play a major role in this game. Others also had a problem with the way this series of events played out. It's already been established that Joel and Tommy are both hardened survivors, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest they should be more cautious in a situation like this. For example, in the first game, Joel is very slow to trust anyone and is able to spot the ambush in Pittsburgh. We also see in a flashback in this game that Joel is fairly paranoid about keeping Ellie's immunity secret, going as far as to tell her that she still needs to wear a gas mask even when no one else is around, just in case word gets out. The first game also shows that Tommy and the community at Jackson are likewise not trusting of outsiders, as we can see when Joel and Ellie first arrive. And Tommy also knows that Joel is hiding from his past. So the fact that this goes out the window and Joel and Tommy both step into this trap with no regard for their safety and then give these people their real names does seem a bit stupid. Moments like this can make the story come across as contrived because it feels like events are playing out in the way writers need them to, rather than in a realistic manner. So these details exacerbated the dislike people had for Joel being killed, and for those who had seen the leaks, this information was already known, meaning people had time to work themselves up into a frenzy over this and other key plot details. However, if there are problems with The Last of Us 2's story, I'm not sure Joel dying is necessarily one of them, and the exaggerated fan reaction doesn't really seem justified to me if it's over Joel's death alone. Writers can kill their characters. As long as it's in service of the plot, killing a character, even if it's in a deliberately shocking way, shouldn't be a problem, as long as it isn't something done repeatedly as an easy way to create drama. People may not be happy with the later seasons of Game of Thrones, but George R.R. Martin's books are a good example of how killing important characters can be beneficial. In fact, the death of one certain important character early on in those books is quite similar to the death of Joel, and the way in which fans praised that particular death is also proof that this is something writers can get away with. But I think for something like this, it all comes down to what the writers do with it. You can kill a beloved character, but it has to be worth it. You're effectively raising the stakes of the story, but you're also raising player expectations, and there is an expectation of some kind of narrative payoff. That doesn't necessarily mean the players have to get exactly what they want and get their revenge. This might be a form of narrative payoff, but it's not the only type. What matters most is that when players get to the end of this game, they walk away from the experience feeling like they witnessed a good story and that this death was an important part of it. And I guess we'll come back to what players walked away from this game feeling. For now though, Joel's death does serve a clear role in the story. It sets up the plot for the rest of this revenge saga. It's worth pointing out here that Ellie pursuing Joel's killer isn't a good idea, and it's probably not what Joel would have wanted. Ellie has a good life in Jackson, and considering all the bad things you see in the first game, the fact that a place like this exists seems a miracle in itself. Giving that up to chase revenge won't bring Joel back to life. It won't remove the grief she feels, and if the main characters of this game didn't have such an insane amount of plot armor, chasing revenge would also be very likely to get Ellie killed. So, if your reaction to Joel dying is, "Fuck Abby, let's chase her down and kill her because I want revenge," then guess what? The story's working. It's making the player share the perspective of the character they're controlling. It's making you connect to their emotions, and it's making you invested. Of course, ultimately, the effectiveness of this all depends on what happens next. And so we begin our 3-day saga in Seattle as Ellie as she clashes with the Washington Liberation Front, a group based in the city that Abby belongs to. This leads to a lot of killing as Ellie chases down leads, at first with her friend Dina, then with an unimportant guy named Jesse, and lastly all alone. You kill Washington Liberation Front members, including many of the group who accompanied Abby to Jackson, but you also kill members of another group called Scars, as well as lots of zombies, lots of cute doggos, and a few unborn babies for good measure. Even when you kill basic enemies, they scream out in pain, and when I say scream, I mean it. And those basic enemies also have names, just like real people. One of them was even playing Hotline Miami, and I play Hotline Miami, what the hell? Dogs and babies are one thing, but I don't want to kill people with good taste in video games. Come on, I'm not a monster. Anyway, this section of the game plays out as a classic story of revenge. Ellie gets more and more blood on her hands, and that takes its toll physically and emotionally. At the end of day 2, Ellie confronts one of the members of the group that went to Jackson, who she ultimately tortures to gain information on Abby. This leaves her visibly shaken. There's a clear shift in tone throughout this, from having the feel of a fun adventure at the start of day 1 when Ellie and Dina joke around and explore the ruins of the city together, to a slow descent into horror and never-ending cruelty, mirrored by the violent thunderstorm that Ellie moves through, now all alone, at the end of day 3. This culminates in her killing 2 more people from the group that went to Jackson, Owen and Mel, with the latter being revealed to be very visibly pregnant. And really, this is still quite a conventional revenge narrative, where the protagonist's search for vengeance leads to a dark journey which questions if that revenge is even worth it. This usually ends in the protagonist getting their revenge, only to discover it was empty, or that they lost something more important along the way, maybe even their own life. As for The Last of Us 2's take on this in Ellie's section, it's not all that original, and it's not all that deep, but it's still violent and stylish and moody and keeps the player engaged in the outcome. But then, the game takes an unconventional turn, and it's here we get into the second big controversy. After killing Owen and Mel, Ellie, now accompanied by Tommy, returns to her hideout where Dina and Jesse are staying. They decide that enough is enough, and that even though Abby is still out there, it's time to leave Seattle. Except before they can do this, Abby turns up looking for her own vengeance over her now dead friends. She kills Jesse and disarms Tommy and Ellie, and then the second half of the game begins as we flash back to 4 years earlier and now play as Abby. You then play the next 12 hours as this character through a series of flashbacks, as well as playing through the same last 3 days of Seattle from her perspective. So this is the second major thing that led to fan backlash, which was primarily over the idea of playing so much of the game as the person who killed Joel. First up though, we probably need to at least acknowledge how Abby looks, because goddamn, those are some muscles. I'm not sure how Abby has achieved such incredible gains in the post-apocalypse, but regardless, it's hard not to at least notice the size of her physique, and it's something many people have commented on, which is unsurprising because Abby is so muscular that it's a bit distracting. Why Naughty Dog decided to design her this way is something I really don't know. A lot of people seem to be equating this design with something political, but if that's the case, I'm not sure I even follow the logic. Honestly, when I played this game, I wondered if the reason Abby was designed this way was just because someone important on the development team just had a big muscle girl fetish. This is supported by an incredibly out of place and awkward nude sex scene with Abby and Owen, and if that is the explanation, I wish that person could have just stuck to jerking off over Skyrim mods like any other respectable man would do. Really, Abby's muscles aren't that important, and the negative fan response to them can certainly be over the top, but it does seem like a very strange design choice. Fictional characters should stand out for their personality and actions, not because they look really weird for no reason. Also, it doesn't help that Abby's voice actor feels miscast.
Let me go after him. I'll walk him back in, we'll get to the bottom.
No.
You said yourself the storm's a few days.
No.
Laura Bailey is very experienced, but Abby is meant to be around 18, and this is not the voice of an 18-year-old, certainly not this 18-year-old. And the presentation of this game is generally so high that something like this really stands out. Still, most fan criticism of Abby isn't about her design or voice acting, it's about her role within the narrative. You see, Abby is the daughter of the Firefly doctor that Joel kills at the end of the first game. This is why Abby travelled to Jackson. Her story is also about revenge, and now the writers want you to empathise with her and understand her decision, which is something many players didn't want to do. They hated Abby, they wanted revenge against her for torturing and killing a character they loved, and now that character is their protagonist and they're expected to root for them instead. It's easy to see why this caused a knee-jerk reaction from people, but I'm not sure there's anything wrong with this in principle. The idea of seeing the villain's point of view, or seeing a second side to a pre-existing story is interesting, as is fleshing out the Washington Liberation Front to make them seem like a relatable group of normal people, rather than just generic nameless bad guys. However, the way the writers go about this is so unsubtle and deliberately forced that it can border on comical. It's clear the writers wanted to take players on a very specific arc. You begin by relating to Joel and Ellie. Joel dies and it makes you angry and sad, just like Ellie, so you want revenge. But then in your quest for revenge, you do so many bad things you start to question if revenge is worth it. Ellie keeps doing these bad things and you're meant to feel bad about that. Then the game switches to playing as Abby, and we see that Abby isn't a bad person, and nor are the Washington Liberation Front. We start to relate to these characters and understand Abby's motivations, which ultimately leads us to be conflicted about who to side with over Abby and Ellie, until after so much continuous suffering, we learn to forgive and walk away from it all, ending the cycle of violence. But the problem with all this is that at each step of this journey, the writer's intent is so painfully heavy-handed that it's hard not to feel like you're being manipulated. Starting with when Joel dies. It wasn't enough to just kill him and leave it there, he had to be tortured before death. And it wasn't enough to have this happen off screen, the players had to be shown his mutilated body multiple times. And it wasn't enough for Abby to just luck into finding Joel, they also had to make Joel save Abby's life first, just to make it seem even more unjust. And it wasn't enough to have Abby's group carefully ambush Joel, instead they had to have Joel and Tommy cheerfully walk right into their trap, unarmed, and start telling everyone their real names like a couple of idiots. And at this point in the story, I thought, fine, the writers aren't going for subtle storytelling, they want this to be provocative. They want this moment to shock, and that's okay, but the story keeps using this in-your-face approach for its entire duration. When playing as Ellie, it's not enough to just kill people, those people have to scream in agony all the time, which, by the way, is something that never seems to happen when you play as Abby. Then you need to torture someone to death by pressing a button. Wow, so original. And then you have to keep killing dogs, and then a pregnant woman, because the game desperately wants to make you feel bad, like it's all your fault. But this just comes across as cheap. The game puts you in control of Ellie, it puts you in this character's shoes so that Ellie feels like your character, but then it takes control away from you at key moments in order to tell its story. Movies and books also tell their story, but with them you're never in control in the first place, and that's a key difference. When a narrative-focused game puts you in control and then takes control away from you whenever the writers want to do their thing, it's jarring. It creates a feeling of disconnect, and it can make you feel less responsible for what's happening because it's more obvious that it's out of your control. When The Last of Us Part 2 forces you to press square to torture someone, you can sit there and not do it. You can try to resist by not pressing the button, but nothing happens. You have to torture this person to advance the game, you have to press square here, and it's very obvious in a moment like this that it's the game making this happen, not me. And it is possible to make an audience feel bad about a character's actions. If you want an example, just look at Breaking Bad, where the audience naturally roots for Walter White, and then as that character becomes more villainous, the audience becomes more uncomfortable precisely because this is a character they have previously been rooting for and empathizing with. The difference between Breaking Bad and The Last of Us Part 2 is one is gradual and subtle and keeps its intentions hidden and its audience guessing. The other makes you press square to torture someone, and I can't believe this is the kind of thing game critics are praising as deep, or worse, as art. If Ellie was really my character, if I actually had control of her, she would have stayed in Jackson and tried to work through her grief there. My first reaction to her wanting to leave and chase revenge was, don't do it. So the fact that she's in Seattle torturing people is not on me, and I'm not going to feel responsible for her bad actions. In fact, the more the game wants me to feel this way, the less I actually want to, because it just creates disconnect and reminds me of how much this isn't my character. Still, it's the next part where I think this reaches breaking point, both for me and for many others. The part where the game wants you to like Abby and suddenly give up revenge and change your allegiance, which, just as before, is done in the most over-the-top and obvious way. Firstly, we get the flashback to 4 years earlier, where we find out that the doctor that Joel killed, Abby's father, is the most amazing guy ever. In his free time, he saves wild animals, because that's just the kind of guy he is. He and Abby have the perfect father-daughter relationship, and when he and Abby talk about the difficult subject of how operating on Ellie will kill her, Abby tells her father that if it was her, she'd want her father to do the operation, because of course she would. Then we see the Washington Liberation Front base, where we get to see how they're all really nice people, and then we play fetch and pat the nice doggies that we've been killing as Ellie, which happens again later with the same dog Ellie kills at the end of day 3. Abby's section focuses on the conflict with another faction, called the Scars, who are at war with the Washington Liberation Front, and the Scars are shown to be infinitely worse people. Therefore, while Ellie has been killing good, normal people all this time, Abby instead kills this evil cult. During this, Abby saves 2 children from the cult, and the youngest, a boy named Lev, then forms a bond with Abby that is similar to that between Joel and Ellie in the first game. And do you like Abby yet? Don't you feel bad for what Joel did when he saved Ellie? Don't you feel bad for thinking that Joel was a good person? Aren't you feeling like a monster for what you did as Ellie? Do you remember those nice little innocent dogs? Well, you stabbed them. Yeah, you pat that dog, you piece of shit. And now look how happy that pregnant woman is, well, was, before you killed her. Ooh, you must feel so guilty, you bad, bad player. Really, it just feels very manipulative. And while some stories might get away with manipulating their audience, The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't, because it's all so obvious, so in your face, and so incessant. It's as if the writers decided a set of specific emotional responses they wanted to force players to feel, but being force-fed these emotions isn't effective storytelling. It's a bit like when a parent is trying to force a child to eat their vegetables, and it just makes the child hate the vegetables even more. Like the writers are saying, here, you will play as Abby for 12 hours, and you're gonna like it, because we want to make some grand point about revenge and forgiveness, so do what we say because that's what's good for you, and don't you dare try thinking for yourself, you stupid, stupid child. And that's wrong. The relationship between a strict parent and a child is not what the relationship between the writer and the player should be. You shouldn't need to spoon-feed your audience in order to elicit a desired emotional response. Instead, you should tell your story and let your audience interpret it the way they want. Let them have the emotional response that's natural for them, not the one you chose for them. This is what great art should be about. It's what it should strive for, and while an artist might have specific intentions, they should still be hidden, things that sit waiting to be unearthed underneath layers and layers of subtext and personal interpretation. And The Last of Us Part 2 fails spectacularly at this. A better story would have allowed players to feel the way they feel, and that doesn't mean the story had to end with Abby dying, but it does mean the story has to avoid relying on players liking Abby. You can't deliberately create an emotional response in people and then dictate all these bullshit terms and conditions and wonder why people suddenly aren't on board with your story. A good story wouldn't need to do that, and the ending of the first Last of Us shows that, because Joel did something very bad and people responded to that in all sorts of different ways, but all of those ways were allowed to be valid. People were allowed to feel what came natural to them, they were allowed different interpretations, and so, despite the fact that a beloved character kills numerous innocent people and potentially dooms humanity, nobody threw a temper tantrum because a character they like might not be doing what they want. Instead, they praised the story and the characters and the writers. I think this is the main thing people disliked about The Last of Us Part 2, and it's certainly the main thing I dislike about it. But there are a few other things that I want to at least touch on in the second half of the game as well. When I started playing as Abby, I was looking forward to the ways in which her story would recontextualise Ellie's. After all, they cover the same period of time, and the idea of seeing a set of events from one character's eyes, and then from a different character on the other side of a conflict, is really interesting as an idea. However, Abby's story recontextualises nothing. The only thing it might make you consider is that the WLF aren't so bad, they're just normal guys, and that Ellie's actions were wrong. But we don't need Abby's story for this. We see enough evidence of this in Ellie's story. So all this effort to humanise the Washington Liberation Front just comes across as unnecessary because they already seemed human. However, when it comes to humanising those you kill, the new group, the Scars, are the exact opposite. Their ideology just doesn't seem reasonable. They follow this absurd extremist set of beliefs where they avoid all technology, except guns, because I guess Americans don't view guns as technology, and then they do stuff like clip the wings of children who misbehave, which means they shatter their arms by repeatedly hitting them with a hammer. Like, what the fuck? Who would do that to a child? It's so cartoonishly evil. In the first game we saw people do terrible things, but outside of David, their reason for doing those things was because of survival. It was the struggle for survival that brought out the worst in humanity. With the Scars, that's not the case. They just have a really evil set of beliefs, because it's their religion. The design of the Scars also seems to be an attempt to dehumanize them. They all have the same appearance, with the same uniform and shaved heads for males, or a single hairstyle for females. In combat, they don't communicate to each other by using real names, like the WLF do. Instead, they use this dumb whistling. And even the name, Scars, just sounds stupid. I had thought The Last of Us Part 2 was trying to avoid the classic gaming trope of generic nameless enemies who are seen as okay to kill because they're the bad guys. But the existence of the Scars completely contradicts and erases this idea, and on top of that, they're not even interesting. The Scars are left feeling underdeveloped, and the information we do have paints them as some cliche, over-the-top, evil Christian death cult, which just seems a bit dumb in an otherwise grounded setting. And because the story is focusing on the Scars and two new characters called Lev and Yara, it ends up having nothing to do with Ellie's story. It's a set of parallel events which are almost completely unrelated, and that just seems boring. It's a bit like a filler arc in an anime you just skim over to get back to the actual story, and it seems like there was a real missed opportunity to tell two interconnected stories where we could have seen the same events from two different perspectives. As for the characters themselves, both those in Ellie's story and Abby's, they're just not very interesting. Naughty Dog once seemed to have a real knack for creating believable dialogue and likeable character interactions, but that seems to have been forgotten entirely in this game. Instead, the characters are dry, and none of them seem to have any real chemistry. The pair the game tries hardest to force is Ellie and Dina, who aren't terrible, but their whole lovey-dovey couple act gets old really quick, which I think is mostly because that stuff is always annoying. Most romances, in all types of media, focus on two characters meeting and falling in love. They don't focus on that period just after they fall in love, and I think there's a reason for that, which is because it's awkward. It's like when you know a real-life couple that won't shut up about how happy they are and how perfect they are for each other. It doesn't matter if it's in real life or fiction, it's annoying and a little bit cringy, and that's Dina and Ellie. Other character duos are worse though, because at least there's something between Dina and Ellie, whereas everyone else is just forgettable. The best dialogue and characterization are in the flashbacks between Joel and Ellie, which serve as a reminder of what's been lost in more ways than one. Anyway, the weaker cast of characters surely hasn't helped fan reception, as it just draws attention to how much better the first game was in this regard, thanks in large part to Joel, the characters the writers kill a few hours into the experience. So by the time you do get to the ending and Abby's and Ellie's stories reconnect, a lot of people are dead, a lot of bad things have happened, and it can be a little hard to care anymore. You're not responsible for the bad things that have happened, despite what the game wants you to feel, and most characters, in particular the two protagonists, Ellie and Abby, are not likeable because of all the bad things they've done. If you've let go of your revenge by this point, as the writers want you to do, there isn't really anything left to hold on to instead. And if you do still crave revenge, well, you won't get it. Although rather than that being something that happens in the confrontation at the end of day 3, instead there is a 4-hour epilogue that unnecessarily draws the ending out far longer than makes any sense. Just for comparison's sake, the first game's ending, which was probably the most praised part of it, lasted about 8 minutes, from the moment Joel rescues Ellie to the credits rolling. 8 minutes versus 4 hours. But length isn't the only difference. Anyway, Abby fights Ellie, but then lets her go because Lev asks her to. Then we skip forward in time to see Ellie and Dina now living alone with their newborn child, and you might wonder why this lesbian couple have a newborn child, but can't even bring myself to explain it, so just accept that's a thing, it doesn't matter. Just move on. Anyway, Ellie and Dina live happily ever after, except Ellie is still haunted by Joel's death. Tommy finds some new information on Abby, but Ellie isn't interested in going for revenge, except then she changes her mind. So again, she hunts down Abby, who has since been captured by a new faction of slavers. Ellie then frees Abby, saving her life, but then she decides she actually wants to kill Abby, but only if Abby is willing to fight back. So Ellie threatens to kill Lev to force Abby to fight her. They try to kill each other again, except as Ellie's strangling Abby to death, she remembers an old conversation with Joel, and then she changes her mind again and lets Abby go. Although I'm not sure how Abby would survive with all those stab wounds anyway. But presumably she does, and Ellie goes home to find that Dina has left. The game ends with her in this empty house, where she picks up her guitar that Joel had previously taught her how to play, except she can't play it anymore because during their fight, Abby bit off 2 of her fingers. And this scene feels like a perfect way for this game to end because it's so over the top and representative of the rest of the game's storytelling. Ellie has lost a part of herself in her quest for revenge, which the writers decide to depict literally by showing how she's lost her fingers. And this also shows how she's lost some of her connection to Joel by the way these events have changed her. When I first saw Ellie's missing fingers in this scene, I couldn't help but laugh out loud, and I'm not sure that's what the writers were going for. In fact, I'm sure this was meant to come across as a piece of profound commentary, but really by this point it was all starting to seem comical. The violence and misery these characters experience is so constant and extreme that it's hard not to be numb to it. I've always thought that violence is something you have to be careful not to overuse. If you look at some of the best examples of movie violence, things like Psycho or Jaws or Alien or Reservoir Dogs, the most effective moments of violence either come out of nowhere and catch the viewer by surprise, or they're preceded by a gradual build-up of tension. By comparison, The Last of Us Part 2 has scenes of ultra-violence from beginning to end, and it's hard to keep taking it seriously. It's like jump scares in a horror game. There's only so many times they can be used before they lose effectiveness. The same is true for all the bad stuff that happens to people. Even after all the Seattle events, terrible things just keep happening. Ellie has PTSD, Abby and Lev get captured by slavers and crucified after they try to escape. Abby gets stabbed repeatedly, Ellie gets her fingers snacked on, and then it ends with Ellie alone, a shell of her former self with no family and friends or anything positive in her life whatsoever. There's other stuff I haven't mentioned too. Of the 2 kids, Lev has to murder his mother because he's trans and she doesn't accept his gender identity, and Yara has her arm repeatedly broken by a hammer, which then gets infected, so it has to be amputated, and then she gets killed anyway. Honestly, it's too much, and not too much is in it so dark that it's hard to stomach, which it certainly could be for some people, but even if you do have a high tolerance to this stuff, it's just too much to keep taking it seriously by the time the credits roll. In the first game, Ellie is almost raped, which is a shocking and deeply disturbing moment. If instead Ellie was actually raped and then tortured and then forced into slavery, that wouldn't have made The Last of Us a better game, it just would have been fucked up. And if stuff like that happened over and over, it would be like The Last of Us Part 2. This game does provide commentary on vengeance and violence, in that it has a strong message that these are bad, and yeah, I knew that, everyone knows that. I don't think that's something anyone needed this game to tell them. It's not exactly a brave or original message, and even when people enjoy a story about revenge, I think they're still aware that revenge isn't necessarily a good thing. A lot of players did want revenge against Abby, but I don't think the game successfully proves the futility of that to these players because they never get to experience that revenge, so they never get to see it as pointless. As for violence, sure, in cutscenes you're made to question violence and the role it plays in video games, but then you go back to the gameplay and killing is as fun as it's ever been. The other theme behind this story is that of the circular nature of violence and vengeance. How violence begets violence, and one act leads to another in an endless loop of destruction. This is what Abby tries to break when she lets Ellie go at the end of the Seattle section, and what Ellie finally learns while strangling Abby after that. There's also an element of learning how to deal with grief and finding acceptance and forgiveness for those who have wronged you. And, that message may have been more effective if it didn't come at the end of these characters doing so many awful things. So what if you can find forgiveness, overcome your grief and break the cycle of vengeance, if, to do that, you have to kill hundreds of innocent people first and suffer through so many awful things? I strongly believe this story is messy and conflicted and not even close to being the deep artistic masterpiece so many critics depicted it as. Which doesn't mean it's terrible. It's still stylish and well presented and generally engaging, but the second half is weak and the ending just feels empty. So what does that mean for the game as a whole and the response of critics and fans? When I started writing this video, I thought I'd try to keep it light-hearted, something about 30 minutes long with a few thoughts on the game itself and a look at the biggest talking points from critics and fans. I guess I've failed somewhere along the way because this is looking a lot longer than 30 minutes and it doesn't feel very light-hearted to me anymore. Previously, I never felt that I disliked The Last of Us Part 2. I honestly do think it's a good game. The gameplay is enjoyable, the presentation is superb, and I had fun with the 25 hours I spent with it. I do agree that the fan reaction was over the top, but now that I've actually spent some time putting my thoughts onto paper, I'm starting to find it a lot harder to say I like this game, and I think I know the reason why. You see, for once, I really was ready to side with game journalists on this one because, call me old-fashioned, but back in my day we used to play games before deciding that they were trash, and so the low user score on the morning of the game's release just didn't sit right with me. But while I don't agree with either the user score or the critic score, now that I've completed the game and had some time to reflect on it, one of these scores seems a lot worse than the other. Not all opinions are equal, but I do feel that within reason we should all get a chance to express ourselves. If people don't like something, they should have a chance to voice that opinion, whether that is by a professional review on an established website, or by a user review on Metacritic, or by a long, rambling YouTube video that no one in their right mind would watch. However, there seems to be a lot of hatred towards user scores, particularly coming from critics themselves. I've seen a lot of people talk about how much fans are overreacting, how stupid the user score is, and how this is why you just can't trust user scores. But no one has a problem with negative user reviews for a game they don't like Star Wars Battlefront 2 or Fallout 76. And yet, as soon as people make negative user reviews for a game critics like, suddenly it's no longer normal people leaving negative user reviews, it's review bombing and bots. And I dislike that attitude because, within reason, people should be able to express themselves, even when you don't agree with them. And saying they dislike some game because they didn't enjoy it is within reason. User reviews are important. They can tell you things about a game which matter, that critic reviews don't always communicate effectively. For example, if a game has microtransactions, this is very likely to lower the user score much more than the critic score, and this can act as a warning for people who might want to avoid games with this feature. The most recent section of Steam user reviews can be a good warning against games that have been abandoned by their developers, or a positive indication for games which have been patched and improved since release. User reviews are valuable for consumers, and no one is forcing you to agree with them. If they aren't useful for you, you can just ignore them. They're only user reviews. They have barely any effect on sales, they don't lead to awards, and they don't make it onto game boxes or promotional artwork. Overall, the consequences of negative user reviews just don't matter that much. There's also been a lot of talk about how the user reviews for this game are just extreme because of politics. In this example, the idea is that The Last of Us 2 has many progressive elements, like multiple LGBT characters, and this will cause right-wing people to dislike the game and give it a lower score. And I completely accept and agree that this is something that happens, probably a lot, probably far too much. Political expression is everywhere on the internet. People are always angry over something, and this can cause reviews to be biased. But this isn't one-sided. If people are critical over something for some right-wing reason, then it's just as likely that people are praising something for some left-wing reason, and vice versa. It's stupid to say that on the internet only one side cares about politics in media. It's definitely not just one side. And when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, there are so many other reasons people may dislike this game that have nothing to do with politics. You can't simply discard these valid opinions just because for some of the people who dislike the game, some of their reasons might be political. And user reviews can be emotional and hyperbolic and biased. They're probably not the most accurate representation of a game's quality, but critic scores aren't some perfect assessment of quality either. People seem to have this opinion that user scores are a problem because they may not be accurate, but when critic scores are inaccurate, that's apparently fine, as if we're holding user reviews to some higher standard than reviews made by professionals who do this for a career, which is insane. You want to know what I think is the biggest reason for the low user score? It's not politics, it's not leaks, it's not the death of any character. It's that the critic score for this game is wrong, and that caused a reaction. A reaction that was magnified by all those other factors, but it's the critic score that really set people off. People want their voice to be heard, they want their opinion to be represented, and for people who don't belong to the gaming media, or have their own YouTube channel or thousands of Twitter followers, and who don't feel their view is being represented, the easy way to remedy that is to leave a user review. And yeah, those people might be angry and irrational, and so they rate the game a 0 or a 1 rather than something more fair like a 5 or 6, but who cares, it's their review. And that leads me back to the reason that I ended up disliking this game, and it wasn't because of Abby or Neil Druckmann or anything like that, it was because the praise this game received from critics is, in my opinion, undeserved. And I care, maybe a little too much, about whether a game is good and whether it's recognised as good by others, and the idea that people are calling this game a masterpiece on the basis of its story just seems ridiculous. It reminds me of a quote I saw in one of Super Bunny Hop's videos that said, "The best way to fail as a critic is to suggest that something's perfect without fully explaining why." And these 10 out of 10 reviews barely justify their scores. They're so full of all these glowing statements that are left completely unsubstantiated because of the strict NDA and the desire to avoid spoilers. Meanwhile, real issues with the game are just sidestepped or avoided entirely, and that's not even the fault of the critics themselves, it's the result of the very infrastructure of this review system that critics can't talk much about the game's most important parts, and the unusually strict NDA Sony imposed on this particular game just cements that fact. And so, that's where user reviews come in. They tell the other side to this story, a little like the Abby section was meant to do in this game. They offer a different perspective, and it's important they exist even if you don't like them, because without them you only get half the discussion. These two scores function together, like yin and yang, and that often seems to be the case. Because I do think, for the majority of games, the score they really deserve tends to be somewhere in between the critic and user score. So, user scores are important. Sometimes critics miss things. Sometimes critics are biased. Sometimes critics are just wrong. And the more wrong they are, the more those non-critics react. It's like a negative feedback loop that keeps things in balance, and of course it's not a perfect system, not even close, but having one without the other would be far worse. I want to end this video by doing something I have never done before, which is to give a game I've talked about in a video a numerical score out of 10. So, in my honest opinion, judging all facets of this game and trying to be open-minded and fair, The Last of Us Part 2 is a solid 7 out of 10, and guess what? If you add the critic score with the user score and divide by 2, that is exactly what you get.